See. Hi, this is Caroline Leavitt. I'm the co-founder of A Mighty Blaze, the book initiative that began the day of lockdown, when independent bookstores shuttered their doors, when authors like myself lost their tours, and when readers were just hungry to have contact with the writers of the books they love or to meet new writers. And so it was started by me and my co-founder, Jenna Blum, and we're now going on 6 years now, I think. So today, we are going to be talking about this book, Ashes to Ashes by Thomas Maltman. And let me tell you a little bit about the book. And one thing I want to tell all of you that is on the right side, there is a chat. And if you have comments or questions for Thomas, just pop them right in there and we'll get to them. There's also a really easy link that I popped up there so you can get all of Thomas's books. They're all wonderful. We like to use bookshop.org, and that would be great if you did too. Okay, so Thomas Maltman is the author of Nightbirds, Little Wolves. Little Wolves is notable because this is a manuscript I saw in manuscript form, and I just fell head over heels in love with it. This is really, really great. And I was really happy when it got published. Little Wolves and the Land. He's won an Alex Award, a Spur Award, and the Friends of American Writers Literary Award. And his work has been an Indie Next and an All Iowa Reads selection. Here, just listen to one of the words of praise about his book. Thomas Maltman's poignant Ashes to Ashes is far and away the best novel I've read this year. Compassionate and lyrically written, it's a story about mysteries, those of the past and the present, as well as the eternal mysteries of the human heart. I fell in love with this book from the first page. I guarantee that you will too. This is from William Ken Kruger, author of This Tender Land. Here's another rave. Ashes to Ashes unfolds in a rural small town, but there's nothing insular or quaint in this story of outsiders. A grieving daughter, a misunderstood son, and a stunted boy giant, all inspired by the spirit of a centuries-old explorer to discover and claim their own lives. Thomas Maltman has written a wise and deeply empathetic novel, as contemporary as an Instagram post, and yet resonant with history. This is one of the best books I've read all years. This is from Lynn Enger, author of American Gospel. So this book has an astonishing premise. What would happen if on Ash Wednesday, the ashes you put on your forehead don't go away? What would that mean? And what would that happen if buried deep in your family home, there's a skeleton of a Viking? What Thomas does is he sort of mixes myth and memory and reality into this stunning novel. So Thomas, welcome. I'm so happy to have you here. Welcome to A Mighty Blaze.
It is such a pleasure to be here with you on A Mighty Blaze, Caroline, and it's a pleasure to have been working with you over all these years. You helped me out quite a bit with Little Wolves, and so I've always remembered that, and I'm deeply grateful for people like you who are out there helping and guiding other authors, and I'm a big fan of your work too. So
thank you so much. To be here. Well, I always say that we're all writers swimming in the same ocean, and it's up to us to help each other avoid the sharks and the box jellyfish and find the beautiful, little islands in the middle that we can rest on. So, I hate the question, where do you get your ideas? Because I think as writers, sometimes we just don't know. They just sort of bubble up to the surface. But a better question, I think, is what was on your mind? What was haunting you? What jump-started the whole inception of this novel? Was it the idea of being an outsider, or was it all the wonderful Viking history that's in the book? What did it for you?
So there are a number of things that inspired Ashes to Ashes, and you mentioned you started A Mighty Blaze in the midst of the lockdowns, and this novel I also started in the midst of the lockdowns, and spending time with every day while the rest of my family slept as I'm writing downstairs. It became something that the story world itself, a place of refuge for me. And so I started it in the midst of the lockdowns. In a way, anybody who had a book that came out in 2020, because that's when The Land came out, that was kind of a lost year for everybody, for writers and read books that came out during that year, because even though book sales went up, it all went up to branded authors, and any book that appeared often got lost. And so I started this book, though, based on a number of different premises. First of all, I am married to a Lutheran pastor. So
I was going to ask you about that. That's really interesting.
Yeah, but I didn't grow up Lutheran, and so Lutheran rituals and ceremonies, it was all brand new to me. And so I found it remarkable, the very first Ash Wednesday service, that the pastor puts this mark on you and basically says, "From dust thou art, and to dust thou shalt return." And then you go sit down again. But, basically it's the one time in the church where the pastor says, "You're going to die." And so it really is a time where you have to reckon with your mortality.
Right.
And so I was struck by the service, and I was struck by the service for another reason too, and that is that my wife had forgotten to order the ashes needed for the Ash Wednesday service.
Oh,
these come supplied by a liturgical company.
So I didn't know you could have ordered them. That's incredible.
Yeah. And so we actually made them ourselves. I'm in the garage of the parsonage. I've got this Folgers can of coffee, and I'm stuffing it with these palm fronds. And then the palm fronds would catch fire at first, so I kept dumping on more and more lighter fluid, and eventually they went up with a whoosh. And the next day at the service, when my wife marked the ashes on people, they didn't wash off right away. And eventually they did. But, they didn't wash off right away. And every year in the years since, I kept thinking about that very first Ash Wednesday service and wondering what would happen in a small town, because we were living in a small town at the time, which was also quite new to me. What would happen in a small town if the ashes didn't wash away? And regardless of what a person believes, how would you act? Would you feel like you were compelled to do something you've never done before? Would you feel like you were blessed or cursed?
Cursed, right.
What would happen? What would happen if you had this mark and you woke up every day with this reminder of your own mortality? And so that is part of what inspired the novel, this kind of magical realism, because there's really no explanation behind it. And this wondering, this kind of season of trials and miracles as these people are wondering, what is going on with these ashes. And so that's part of what inspired the novel. And I'm writing it during the lockdown, and writing it and thinking about all of these things as well too. I should say, as well too, I partly started it on a dare, Carolyn. My wife challenged me to write a story without killing any of the characters. And so screen is kind of going blank a little bit, but I discovered that it's quite difficult and not to kill any of the characters if your story is set during a global pandemic. And it's even more difficult if you bring in Vikings into your story as well.
Yes,
I wasn't able.
I want to talk about those Vikings. Tell us about how you came to write about Norse mythology, and tell us about the Vikings in the story, because it's fascinating.
I'm always looking for those lost corners of history. I love history, and I especially love those parts of history that other people didn't know about. And so years ago, I was visiting a bookstore in Alexandria, and in Alexandria, they have the Kensington runestone. And this Kensington runestone has all of these runes marked on it. And the legend is that Vikings came to Minnesota in the year 1362 and marked up this stone. However, many people consider this stone to be a fraud, but I just felt myself enchanted by the legend. I was fascinated by it. And so I kept asking myself, what would have happened if Vikings had come to Minnesota in 1362? And so that really triggered my imagination. It sparked this whole story of this stowaway named Brynhild, who stows away as the Vikings are headed. They called America Vinland, the place of wine and plenty, as they're heading to Vinland. And it's the story of what happens to her as she arrives on shore in America. And so I'm fascinated by Vikings sagas. The sagas, I think, are just amazing stories. And that was part of what inspired me, this whole what if question. I really enjoyed writing those sections, Caroline.
Yeah, I want to talk more about those sections. There are definitely a few sections in the book that are written from a Viking point of view or a Norse point of view, and they've got a different cadence to it. They've got a different kind of poetical language. What was it like to write those, and when did you make the decision to include those chapters?
Great question. So I started them actually as prose, and they weren't quite working in traditional prose format. And again, I love the poetic eddas, which is one section of the Viking sagas. They're written as poems. And I used to teach history and structure of Old English, and love stories like Beowulf and stuff like that are written as epic poems. And so I thought, why not try writing this as a poem? And I have a degree in poetry. That was my emphasis as an undergraduate. I studied creative writing poetry, and I thought I was going to be a poet at one time. And actually, I have published. My very first book was a little chapbook of poetry before I went back to graduate school to study fiction writing. But I love poetry, and I didn't always love poetry. When I first started studying it, I hated poetry, but then I came across Dylan Thomas's poem "Fern Hill," and the very ending of that poem has these two lines: "Time held me, green and dying, though I sang in my chains like the sea." And I just thought I'd never read anything so beautiful, and I wanted to be in the presence of beauty like that. And so that's really where I kind of fell in love with poetry. And so I thought, why not try these chapters as poetry? Will my editor go for it? And I was surprised because my editor, he loved those sections. He said, yes, let's do it. Let's put poetry in the midst of this novel. And so that's how those sections ended up as poems, kind of like one of the original poetic eddas or the sagas, because I wanted the reader to have this feeling that they were entering into a different time period,
Right.
that different cadence that you talked about. I wanted that feeling to be in the story too.
There's so much in the book about stories, the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves, the stories we tell ourselves about our communities, the stories communities tell us. Do you think that communities are formed by the stories they tell?
I think absolutely that story has a powerful role in our lives. The stories that we tell about ourselves, for instance, can heal us. The people who are suffering from trauma or wounds. So years ago, the writer Kevin Kling visited my campus, and Kevin has a withered arm, but his other arm was injured in a motorcycle accident. And Kevin said that he couldn't sleep for a long time after that accident. And but what happened one time is one time as he was laying there in bed, he simply imagined the accident again, and he changed the story where his motorcycle was able to dodge this car. And so instead of an accident,
Wow.
it didn't happen. So he still had that injured arm, but now in his mind, he changed the story, and he was able to sleep again. And so that healing started on a mental level, and it started based on the story he told himself. So the stories that communities have, I really do think they play a sacred role in our identity and shaping who we are and shaping how we think about the world and shaping how well we can move through the world too.
That's very much a cognitive therapy kind of thing where you change the way you look at something and then your interior feelings also change. So that's kind of remarkable. I want to talk about the giant kid, Basil or Basil. I don't know which way do you pronounce it yourself?
It's Basil, and he's named
Basil.
after the North Stars. Yeah, the North Star enforcer Basil McRae was a famous hockey player who was kind of known for his violence in the hockey rink.
Okay, so Basil's this kid in deep difficulty. He doesn't have parents to support him. He's called a gentle giant because he's big. He has trouble reading. He and his friends are outsiders. But I always felt that there was a kind of grace around this kid. And I felt that you yourself as the writer had a deep sense of care for this boy. Is that true?
Absolutely. He's my favorite character from the novel. Basil's quite different from me. I'm not a giant. I didn't have difficulties reading the way that he did. But I loved the idea, you mentioned about stories, and he ends up finding this kid goes from not being able to read to really discovering a kind of power and grace in both poetry and stories. And years ago, I'd come across the story of this Pulitzer Prize winning poet who was born dyslexic. And
Mhm.
he struggled with dyslexia, but eventually what he was able to kind of overcome his dyslexia by imagining himself as somebody else, as this other person. And so I wanted the idea of this character who, starts imagining himself as this other person, and is really able to discover, a new kind of power through stories and through reading and through poetry. And so that's part of what inspired that character when I was originally writing about him. And definitely he was somebody that I really felt for in the story.
So I wanted to ask you about the research you did in this story about Vikings and this and that. And this is a two-part question. And the second part is I wanted you to talk about, how the Viking sections complement or contrast with the rest of the narrative in the town. And by the way, the town's name is Endwen, which I thought was just fabulous. That's a really good name for a town. So can you talk about those things?
Sure. Yeah, Anduin is partly based on, there's a town just a little bit north of us called Nowthen.
Oh,
And I was intrigued by it, but I wanted to put my own spin on things. And I like that idea of that the town being named Anwin, just the sense of anticipation of something is about to happen, and when. But yet, ironically, it's this town where they feel like nothing ever happens. But in the story, it's really the story of the winter where everything seems to happen all at once. And Brynhild's saga, which is the Viking sections of the novel, really tell the story of a journey, this story of one woman's journey to the new world, and what she finds there and the people she meets along the way, including indigenous people. And so I really feel like, too, all of the characters in the novel are on a kind of journey of their own, that they're on this almost kind of spiritual journey, this internal journey. Even though they almost never leave the town of Anwin in the story, they're on a journey in their own way. And so when the remains are discovered of this on this farm, nobody knows. Do the bones belong to an indigenous person? And when they're found not to belong to an indigenous person, people wonder, could it have been, one of these Vikings from way back in 1362? And it's certainly a story that inspires the three of the central characters in the novel, the three teenagers who, are moved by the story. One of them is named Morgan, and her mother was an archaeologist. And I mentioned earlier that a lot of people consider the stone to be a fraud. And her mother in the story believed in the stone. And because she believed in the stone, was basically ridiculed and cast out of her position as an assistant professor. She lost her job. And then she got cancer and passed away. And so Morgan's really kind of haunted by this legend. And so when the remains of this Viking explorer, Viking person potentially Viking person are discovered, she is really moved by it, and she really wants this legend to be true and to be real, because it's a story that connects her with her mother. And here we're coming back to that power of
right.
stories. And so there's a really strong correlation between those Viking sections and what's happening in the present, because Morgan longs for this story to be true, because it's a story that binds her to her mother.
Yeah, I think there's a lot in this book to me that felt like a prayer, a kind of prayer. A lot of these people felt judged when they couldn't get the ashes off, and there was one line in the book where someone said, "Why would God pick on ordinary people in a nowhere town?" But to me, I felt that you were almost proving that there's magic in everything and everywhere, no matter how mundane you might think about it on the outside. Is that true? Is that right?
Absolutely. One of one of my other favorite characters in the story is actually the mother figure of Lucas Halverson. Her name is Shelley Halverson. And Shelley is, she's kind of a skeptical character, but she's also somebody who's really kind of intrigued by this. But there's one section in the story where she talks about this Facebook page that one of the town residents starts. And this Facebook page is called The Miracles of Lent. And so, but when Shelley's reading this page, she's kind of like, these are kind of ordinary things. I don't know if I'd necessarily call this a miracle. And so, I am fascinated in the way that people find magic in ordinary things, magic in just the things that we don't quite expect. And I think that's something that also moves Shelley in the story too.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Without giving anything away, I want to say that the ending broke me in the best possible way, which is a high compliment. Did you always know your ending? I'm always curious if writers know what they're writing towards, or if it just surprised you in some way.
Well, I would say it didn't so much surprise me. I did the original ending that I wrote of the novel. It didn't quite work. And I showed the pages to my writing group, and they looked at those pages and they thought, what, I think you need to start over. And so sometimes if there's a problem with the ending, you've got to go back to the middle of the story. And so I went back to the middle of the story, and instead there's this massive windstorm that causes this tree to topple over and turn over. And it reveals the grave of this person on this farm. And so that changed the ending of the story, and it made it so much a better story. So I didn't always know the ending of the story. It was something that I had to discover through the process and through the trial and error of writing.
Give us a day in the life for you. What's your writing day like? You also teach too, so tell us what a typical day is like for you.
So that's great. Yeah. I love to write first thing in the morning. And so I mentioned that writing this novel, for instance, I had a strict rule, like no social media, no checking the news. Everybody's still asleep. I love writing in the dark, and writing while everybody is still dreaming away up there. And I have the house to myself. I have the quiet time to myself. And so that was one of the major things that really kind of fed into the story. And so that is one of my big writing habits too, is that I write first things first thing in the morning.
That's good.
I'm always writing.
And what is it like to teach? Go ahead. Sorry.
Sure. No, you go ahead.
What is it like What is it like teaching other students, and what does it bring to your own work, and what do you feel you bring to their work? And here's a three-part question. What is the worst writing advice you could give your students? And then what is the best? 4-part. Sorry.
Wow. So one of the best advices that I would give to my students is to write what you love. So I really discovered that, that I love history, that history fascinates me, that I want to find out more about it. What I find, Caroline, is that during the semester, when I am teaching, I have less time than ever to write. And so you think that I should be getting less and less writing done. But what I also find is that that somehow just the energy of being in the classroom, of interacting with people face to face, it gives me a kind of energy for my writing too. And so ironically, in this time period when I have the least amount of time to write, it's often when I'm at my most productive and where I'm getting the most writing done, where the ideas are coming to me. And part of it, that is just being fed by this well of stories that I'm also discovering from students and from these interactions that I'm having in the classroom. Just also, it electrifies my writing too. So,
yeah, you need that input, that give and take with people. So, what do you think? Well, you already answered the advice question. Okay, so what would people be surprised to find on your night table of things you read? I'm asking this for a purpose because there's always this question in the New York Times Sunday Book Review, and people always say, "Oh, I'm reading Proust or I'm reading Hemingway," and that's all well and good, but maybe they're also reading something a little quirky or even just for fun. So I'm curious about, like, highbrow, lowbrow. What would be surprised to find that you like to read?
Well, I think you might find things. I'm here at my desk and at my downstairs desk, and I apologize. I was going to be upstairs in
No, this is
private room
lovely
where
where you
there
are.
wouldn't be people wandering past. But my laptop, the camera wouldn't work on it, so that's why we're downstairs here.
Oh, okay.
So, so if there's people wandering past, that's the reason why, occasionally. So you wouldn't be surprised to find a book like this. This is I'm currently working on a story set back in the 19th century American West. And so here's Empire of the Summer Moon, and this is also a really fascinating book. It's so great. It's about the rise and fall of the Comanche Nation. You wouldn't be surprised to find, since I am right here at my desk, a book on writing, because I'm
is that a good one? Is that a good one? Oh, right. That's true.
That's a good one. This one, self-editing for fiction writers, how to edit yourself into print. I think it has a lot of really good writing advice about how to revise your chapters. And so, you would find things like that. But you might not expect to find things like children's stories. So I am fascinated by, and in fact, I've written a children's novel that I haven't published yet about Bigfoot, called The Secret Sasquatch Society. But you would also find some children's stories that are right around me. So like these classic fairy tales here too. I love fairy tales. And so these are all things that expected or unexpected, books of poetry, books of research that are going to be surrounded by. And, I guess my weakness, lowbrow, might be fantasy. I love fantasy novels too. And so you might find some of those around.
Great. Thank you for being honest about it. That's great. So I want to show this gorgeous cover again, Ashes to Ashes. Don't forget that I put up the link in the chat, so it makes it really easy for you to order. You can go to your favorite indie bookstore. I want to thank everybody for being here and for the questions. Oh wait, Robin has a comment. She said, "What? Reading for fun? At this stage of my life, it's all for fun and enjoyment, even the deep ones." That's great. That's great. Robin also said, "I encourage people to change the channel, the video or snapshots that replay in their heads of trauma, death, or the source of their grief." That's a really wise thing to say. And, that's very cognitive therapy too. It's how you look at things, like what lens. So anyway, I want to thank everybody. We will see you all next week. Thomas, you hang on so I can thank you properly. Here is the wonderful book again, Ashes to Ashes. All of Thomas's books are wonderful. I especially have a soft spot for Little Wolves, which I read in manuscript. So seek that one out too, because that is just great. And we'll see you all tomorrow or next week. So thank you so much. Thomas, thank you. Stay on. I'll be with you in a second, Thomas.
Thank you.